All right, so today what we're going to look at is we're going to continue looking into React, and we're going to look at how to handle user events and look kind of more with component state. So go ahead and open up the same app that we did from last week. Next week we'll kind of actually start with something new, but we're just going to build off of last week's material. Does anybody not have this? Okay, cool. Yeah, so go ahead and open yours up. Or does anybody actually want to start, like maybe you messed yours up and you want to start from like my exact thing? Okay.
It's just in the code link, right?
Yeah. So although we haven't really, so if you click on this code link right here, you can do download. So I'll just do download zip. And you can open this up. So this process, I mean, it's kind of useful if you've never worked with like, not you have to kind of pull an existing application, then this will kind of be useful if you've never done this before. So I'm going to open my terminal and say cd and just kind of cd into this folder. And if I do ls, kind of list out what's in here. Now, you might try like npm start, but then you're going to get an error. And this is because if you notice from our kind of previous, like if I open up the one we did last week, there was this node modules folder right here. And this includes like all the stuff to make this run. So it includes React and some command line stuff from create React app and basically all the libraries that make our app run. And we don't have that right here. So what you need to do is run npm install, or you can just say npm i for short, from within this directory. And this will go ahead and install all this stuff. So we'll give this a minute. This is like the general process. Like if you were to hop on somebody else's project, like you would do this exact same thing. You would kind of download it, or git clone if you're familiar with that. We'll kind of clone it, run npm install inside of here, and then we'll have access to the libraries, and then we could run it by using npm start. And then everything works. So really, it's just kind of downloading an npm install inside. I'm going to close this one just because I'm going to kind of build off my other instance, but for anybody who wants to do it this, you can do this way. Yeah, so this kind of goes for this code link and anything probably going forward. I'm going to delete this. Can you guys see this okay, or do you want me to turn off the lights? Lights? No? Okay. Okay, so I'm going to run npm start for this app. And just to kind of review what we did last week, so I'm also going to open up the Chrome console just because it's really helpful just having this debugging tool open. And I'm going to put it on the bottom. Okay, so what we did last week was we fetched data from 2 GitHub API endpoints that got the list of members for an organization and the list of repos for an organization. And so everything starts off with the app.js file. So, well, actually, everything kind of starts off, gets kicked off from the index.js file, so where the app component gets rendered. And this app component had a component did mount lifecycle method that says when this component gets rendered on the page, we'll go ahead and fetch the data. We'll set that data on this this component's state, and the render method will go ahead and render all this stuff. So we kind of have some loops over here to render it, and then while it's processing, we have a loading component being rendered. So I think to start, just to kind of review a little bit, I was thinking maybe we could convert these to their own component, just to start off a little easier. So I was thinking for this app, maybe one type of organization would be to create a component called member list. It's really up to you, I think, how you come up with these components and what you even want to come up with a component. In some cases you might be fine with your code like this. Maybe other cases you want to take this list and use it in other spots, or you just like the idea of having a component called GitHub API members list. It's really kind of up to you, so I wouldn't say there's any wrong way of doing it. It's just kind of your personal preference. So just for kind of the sake of reviewing, and this might be something you'd see, is let's create a component for the entire list. So we'll call this GitHub members list.js. Actually, you know what? Let's rename this to GitHub repos list. I'm actually going to delete the member stuff in a minute, so we'll do this one. Okay, so in here we have to import React, so we're going to say import React from React, and then we need to export the component, and we learned we could either use a class or a function, and typically when you have things like lifecycle methods, a class works great. So things like component did mount, that's when a class works great. But if you're literally just rendering some like a JSX fragment, you're just kind of returning some markup, then a function usually works great. So in this case, we're just going to kind of wrap up this right here in kind of its own component. So I'm just going to say export default function GitHub repos list, and this will receive all of the properties when that component is invoked. And here we're going to say let's return a div. And then we'll go ahead and just kind of copy this right here. Or it's more like we'll copy this piece. So I'll copy that. So everything from the part where we kind of loop over all of the repos and create a GitHub repo card for each one, that's what we're going to kind of copy over. So, oops. So I'll paste it over here like this between curlies. Now, if you're using VS Code, it's probably going to suggest some errors. So the first thing is there's this red underline. It's saying GitHub repo card is not defined. So we should go back to app.js and copy this import. So we'll cut it from here and move it over here since we need access to this component. And then going back to app.js, we will delete this piece, and let's invoke this component. So I'm going to say GitHub repos list. So we're going to invoke the component, and I haven't imported it yet at the top, so that's why the red line, but I want to show, so what would this invocation of this component look like? So we're going to say, we'll call this, let's see, what was it actually called before? Oh, repos, okay. We'll call this repositories equals, close this. And if we look at where these repositories come from, it's in this.state.repo. So I'm just going to copy this and paste it like that. Now I wanted to, I got a few questions on this regarding kind of like assignments and stuff. So like these two names don't need to be the same thing. In my examples, maybe last week, I may have done something like this where I said repos equals and then maybe the same thing, but they actually don't have to be the same thing. This key over here is used internally in this component, and then this is kind of, this is available in this current scope right here. I'm going to intentionally call it something different, so maybe it might clarify just as we go through it, but a lot of times people just kind of name them the same thing instead of coming up with like two different names. But so I'll say repositories equals this state.repos. Okay, so let's fix this error just to make sure it's imported at the top. So I'll go back to the top and I'll say import. I'm just going to copy this name. Import this from that. I'll collapse some of these other things. Okay, so now inside of this component, so we called it repository, so we need to kind of adjust this a bit. So here we're going to say props.repositories.map instead of this.state.repos, because the repositories are now as passed in as a component property. So props.repositories.map, and then everything else should stay the same. So now if we go back to app.js file and save, and check out the browser, everything should still work. And I just learned about Google Profile, so I get this link again, so I'm using a different like school context. I need to install the React DevTools. Let's see.
Trying to like manage your normal and your incognito for the different accounts that you need to go logged into at the same time.
Yeah, I'm trying to create more context like the work, personal, and school. So
Makes sense.
Let's see. There we go. Okay, so hopefully everything still works. And if we look at the component tree, so we click on this, which is from React DevTools, and we scroll down, you can see here's this GitHub repos list component, and then there's all the children, which contain the GitHub repo card components. So it's up to you really how you want to kind of, manage what your components look like. Maybe you find this useful, maybe you don't. It's really up to you. Any questions? Yes.
Can you go back to the repos list file?
Yep. Okay, so let's clean this up a little bit. I think when we load this page, let me close this for a sec. You'll see like there's 2 loading indicators. I mean, it's just kind of the same thing. It would just be maybe a little cleaner if there was just one. So see, I'm actually going to delete this paragraph. Okay, so kind of like in when we learned handlebars, we could kind of do something like this. Like you could say if loading, close the if. Oh shoot. Then you would say something like loading, like this is like a mix of JSX and handlebars, but something like this. Like how can we achieve this? So what we can do here is we can just kind of open up some curlies. And this is another type of like conditional rendering. So I can say, well, we kind of learned last week, we could say, we learned this ternary statement. So it's like a shorthand if. So I could say this.state.loading. If this is true, then I'll invoke the loading component. Otherwise, I'll just do an empty string. Yes?
So can you not use regular if statements?
You can. It just makes things like messy. And generally, I think in React, like, well, that's a really good question. Like last week, I posted a link to conditional rendering, and this like ternary statement was one approach. We'll look at another one right now. But you generally won't find like actual if statements. It's just not a common practice. But yeah, highly recommend kind of reading through these links because this will go through like, different cases of how do you like conditionally render things.
It's always a balance between being too cluttered and too hard to understand. And for something where you're just selecting, for something like that, there's not a lot of risk of getting confused by the ternary.
Yeah. Okay, so I have this little statement here. So now I can kind of actually go back to here and just delete this piece for both the members and the GitHub repos section. So I'm just going to delete both of these. And then here, I don't need to put this like component invocation in curlies, the GitHub repos list. I'm going to go ahead and delete that. And save it. And if I go back to the app, everything still works. So that's cool. So we just kind of have like one loading indicator and then just all the stuff that's rendered beneath it. Now this is kind of weird because it's more like if this thing is true, do this, then do an empty string that's false. Like it'd be nice if we can kind of clean this up. And if you check out the conditional rendering section, there's another technique, and we can actually do something more like this. So we can say this.state.loading double ampersand, and then say loading slash. Whoops. And then I'm just going to delete the other one. And this is effectively the same thing as the statement above it. And so, like, what's going on here exactly? It's like kind of cryptic. And I agree. It's like one of those things I didn't do before React, so it's a little weird. But this is just kind of an actual JavaScript thing. So in JavaScript, I could say, like, the result of it, if I say something like true and 5, the result of this expression is actually just 5. It's the second thing. So if the first thing is true or considered true, then the second thing gets returned. I could say, like, the number 1 is actually, it gets converted to true. It's considered truly. So I could say 1 and 4, and then 4 gets returned. So it's like a Boolean expression in JavaScript. And so basically, if the first thing of this expression is considered truly, the second thing gets returned. Now, if I were to say something like false and 5, then it's the first thing because this thing was considered isn't true, so that gets returned. So kind of weird, but it's like a thing in JavaScript that you can do. And so in React, you'll kind of find this type of like conditional rendering pretty frequently. You'll see it like in docs or blog posts or even just come across cases. And for example, this was one case where, this was a little weird where I had to say like an empty string, but I could just conditionally render it. If this loading is true, then it's going to go ahead and render this. So now you kind of know 2 types of conditional rendering, but yeah, definitely kind of read through some of these links that I post because they'll go into like different approaches and edge cases or for different situations. Any questions? Okay, so one thing I want to do is I'm actually going to remove the call to member images just because as we're going to build this out, we might hit the GitHub. GitHub has like an API rate limit, and when you make 2 calls on every page load, it just hits it like twice as fast. So we're going to remove it just so we don't hit it and then we don't run into any issues. So I'm going to intentionally delete this section. So the members portion. And then in the component did mount section, I will, we'll just kind of quickly rewrite this. We'll say let repos is equal to await get repos, and then I'm just going to comment out this. And then I'm going to I'm going to delete the members in the set state call on line 24. So we'll just be dealing with repos for now. Okay, so let's go ahead and start doing user events. So this is pretty much, as of now, read only. We're just fetching data, rendering it, but there's no like clicks or form submits or mouse overs, any of that stuff. So what does that look like? Kind of going back to first week, if you remember the example, we had the page and we had 2 buttons at the top, and one was for members and one was for repos, and you click on members, it showed members. If you clicked on repos, it showed repos. So let's kind of simulate that so we can kind of get a feel for like how do we do click handlers. So I'm going to go back to app.js, and I'm going to add a button. So this one will say members. Actually, you know what? Sorry, not members, repos. Okay, so what we can do now is kind of like if you're familiar pre-React and like just with plain JavaScript, you are probably familiar with like onClick equals double quote, and you could like throw an alert and write a little bit of JavaScript in here, or maybe you say like document.get element by ID and change some styles onto the page, or maybe you call a function. It in React it's kind of similar. It's instead of having a string, so onClick equals string, we're going to say onClick but with a capital C, so it's following that camel case, and then equals curly braces. And this is where we're going to specify a function. So in this case, I am going to say this.fetch repos, and I'm going to create this function on the class. So here I'm going to say fetch repos. I'm just going to create another method on this class. And I'm just going to say clicked. I'm actually going to turn off one of these extensions that I have. Okay, that pop-up won't come up so much, which is kind of annoying. Okay, I think that also shut down. Yeah. Okay, so I need to run npm start again. Okay, so if I click on repos, you can see that we get clicked on the console. So that's cool. Everything works. So let's actually make this. So let's modify this so that when this page loads, we don't fetch all the repos and render it. We're going to do it based off that click event. So I think the first thing that we want to do is kind of delete, or we're going to copy this piece and paste it here. And you can kind of get rid of the console log clicked. And I'm just going to comment it out for now just because we're going to work on it in a sec. But we can go ahead and delete the component did mount because we're not going to have it on page load anymore. And while we're at it, since we deleted the members state property, we can actually, this is just unnecessary, so we can just delete members empty array because it's not even being used. Okay, so going back to this, I'm going to comment out the first line, and VS Code is kind of just giving me an error. It's saying parsing error, can't use keyword await inside an async function, and that's because I forgot to say async. So you can only use await inside async functions. So we'll do that first. and then we have the set state piece. So let's see if this works. So I'm going to save it. We'll go back. This is kind of a, well, okay, that's probably confusing. Loading, we'll say false, just because we're not doing it on the first page load. And we could actually change this up a bit. So when we call on fetch repos, we're going to set loading to true instead of it just automatically being true when this page loads, and then we'll set it to false after the data comes back. Okay, so let's go ahead and check this out. So we got a button that says repos. If I click it, we're going to get an error, and it says cannot read property set state of undefined. And so why is this? And so the actual issue is because if we were to, you'll probably run into this error a lot, just not even in React, but like in all JavaScript, you'll see cannot read something of undefined. Usually it's like trying to execute a function off of undefined. Happens all the time. and so what this is saying is it can't call this function set state off of undefined. So why is this turning out to be undefined? So if I do just a quick console log and console log this and save it, and then we go back to our app and hit this repos button, you're going to see undefined was logged to the console. So this is being undefined when it normally isn't. And so hence it can't access the set state method to invoke it. So why is this? And so this goes back to just kind of JavaScript. So if I were to say, let's create an object called person, and I create a method on here called hello. And I just say, let's see, we'll say return hi. Now if I say person.hello, we get back hi. So, you know, everything works. Now let's say I take hello and assign it to another function. So I could say, I'll create a variable, I'll just call it hello, and set this equal to person.hello. And you notice here I'm not actually invoking it. I'm just saying grab this function, person.hello, and assign it to a variable called hello. And I could actually just call this, maybe we'll just call it hi, just so it's not the same. Doesn't really matter. But then I could say hi, and it returns hi. So everything, you know, it looks mostly the same. Now, what if I go back to this hello function and throw in a console log this? You'll notice that, let me comment this out. When I do it this time, person.hello, the this value is this entire object. It's basically this person object. Now if I comment this one out, we'll see that when I execute hi, console log is undefined. And so the value of this really is determined when a function is executed. And so in this case, we're executing hello, but it's being called off of person. And so this points to person. But when we grab the function and we don't call it off of person, but we kind of assign it to something else, so it no longer really knows about person, then when we execute it, it becomes undefined. So I think the two main takeaways is this is just kind of like a JavaScript thing. Like this keyword this is determined when a function is invoked or executed. And so in this case, it kind of lost the context of person And in this case, it's being called directly off of person, so it knows how to determine this. And this is just kind of like one of those JavaScript quirks that is kind of weird because like if you go to other languages, passing functions around like this is maybe less common, unless you have like some newer languages, like you can kind of do it. But JavaScript is kind of unique in this aspect. And that's kind of what's happening here in this React application. I've grabbed access to this fetch repos function, passed it here, and so when I click it, it's calling the function, but it doesn't know what this is. So, so there's a few different ways we can kind of fix this. And I'm going to show both because you'll probably see this in like the React documentation or blog post. And so the quick way is to say, get rid of async in front of it and say fetch repos is equal to a fat arrow function, and then I'm going to move that async keyword over here. So I just kind of like reformatted it how it was defined in the class. And if I save this, this should make it work.
What does that do?
So this, like when this class is defined, it's going to take this, it's going to kind of treat it like a regular method, but it's going to retain the value of this when that object is created. So it's sort of like a new syntax that remembers this. So just to see it kind of working, if I go back over here, you can see it made the call, it logged the correct this, which is the app component, so everything works. Like the keyword this is probably one of the most confusing things in JavaScript, and so there's like a handful of edge cases that you just kind of have to, I can point some blog posts and stuff, but it's one of those things that trips up a lot of people, especially new to JavaScript, because it's not always the same thing. It's like, because it's determined when a function is executed, it could be a lot of different things. And there's like, I don't know, I think, one time I did an interview and they went through all of them. So it's like, what would this be in this case and this be in this case? There's like, I don't know, I kind of remember there being like 6 or 7, but yeah. So if you kind of check out like probably any JavaScript book, they'll kind of list out all of them and you just kind of remember them. So this is kind of one way of getting around it. Now, this is a really like new experimental feature in JavaScript. I think, so like in order for new features to make it into the JavaScript language, it has to go through like 4 stages. And I think this last time I checked was like stage 2, which is super experimental, but it was, I think, convenient enough that the React team put it inside Create React App CLI. So it's there because it's kind of handy, but it is pretty experimental. So it could be one of those things that get like pulled out and then, you have a lot of code that's maybe old, has this like unofficial feature. I don't know, but either way it made it so you can kind of use it. And it still works in browsers because behind the scenes, Create React App does take all this code that you write and turns it into like JavaScript that all browsers understand. So even though this is kind of experimental, it will be cross-browser. So this is kind of one approach. I'm gonna, if you want, you can copy this and just paste it, and then I'll show the other way. I'm going to Control Z just to kind of go back to the old approach, or another approach. Okay, so the second approach is to say, when this component is created in the constructor, I can say this dot, I'm going to create a new property, and I'll say something like handle click repos button. Maybe that's kind of verbose, but so I'm going to create a new property, and I'm going to access, I'm going to say this dot fetch repos. So I'm going to get access to this method, but I'm going to call this function called bind and pass it this. And so what does this bind function do? So this is kind of interesting. So well, okay, so, let's see, yeah, let's finish this first. So kind of going back to this, I am going to now update this onClick handler to be, instead of this.fetch repos, we're going to say this.handle click repos button. So we're accessing this property, which took this function and bound it to the instance of the app component, which is this. Yes.
So can you explain the difference again between like setting a property of this versus like setting a property within like the state of this?
Oh, yeah, like the differences between the two? Yeah. So like this would be a property on this app instance class. And then state is really just an object, which is also an instance property on this class. So these two are like state, like this right here and this right here. Those are like siblings.
Okay.
And anything, so whenever we call state, we're essentially putting properties inside of this object. So
Okay.
yeah, but you could think of like this and this to be siblings,
Okay.
sibling properties.
Cool. Thanks.
Okay, so on click, we're going to call handle click repos button, save it, and we call bind this. And I'll kind of dive more into this thing because you'll see this probably pretty frequently too. Let's see. Oh, okay. So I'm getting an error. It says cannot use keyword await, so I forgot to put that back. So let's put async next to fetch repos. And if I click on this button, everything works again. Okay, so let's look at this bind method. So the interesting thing about functions in JavaScript is functions can have properties that are also functions. Super weird, but like you can say, for example, let's see. Okay, so going back to this little example. So functions in JavaScript can also have their own properties that are functions because they are objects. So it's like very wordy and sounds confusing. But what this means is, so like right here, I have a function. So I've captured this person.hello function and stored it in a variable called hi. Now, this function also has its own functions, certain functions though, and one of them is this is the bind function. And so I can say hi and bind it back to person. So I'll say hi is like I guess I could say like, let's call this bound hi is equal to hi.bind.person. And now if I call bound hi, we'll see that the this for the console log is the person object. So bind essentially allows you to like take a function and control what the value of this is when it's executed. So in this case, I'm saying whenever hi or so this actually produces like a new function, and this new function I can tell it what does this really mean. And in this case, I'm saying it's person. So when we call bound hi, we can see console log this is person right here. Now I can actually do this, and I can change it to be, let's just make up an object. I'll say name David. And so now you can see like when I call bound hi, the console log of this is what was passed to bind. So it's like this, it allows you to control what does this mean when you execute a function. So bind creates a function that controls what this is. So that's kind of going back to our React example. We're grabbing fetch repos and we're binding it to this, meaning kind of the app component, assigning it to a whole new property, and then just accessing that property down here.
So is this like method of doing it? Is this like the older, like more used method?
Yeah, I think like you'll probably see a lot, like even the React docs have this quite a bit. But then in like newer blog posts, or even I think even in the React docs too, it's like kind of both. You'll see the first approach that I did. So just so you're not confused, yeah. There's like another way too, but I'm not going to even get into it. Those are like probably the two most common ways. Okay, so any questions? Okay, so I think for now, let's just do like an exercise and do the same thing, but for members. So kind of add a button in there, make it so that you click it, you fetch the members, and show it on the page, so you can try it yourself. And then we'll maybe start back up at 7:15. Okay, so hopefully most of you got it. So let's just kind of do it together. And I'm going to, I'll do it the other way so that we have both examples documented so you can see kind of like both binding approaches. So I'll say fetch members is equal to a fat arrow function, and we'll give it the async keyword. And I'm going to delete that console log from the other one. And we can pretty much copy the same thing and paste it in here, but instead of saying repos, we'll just call this members. And then the function name was get members. And then we'll add a button kind of right next to the other button, and it says members. And here we can just say this dot fetch members, since it's using this style of like binding. So we also need to have a component that kind of, or we need to show the list, which we actually deleted previously. So I guess we can just kind of create another component for this. We'll just copy this other one, and I'll say GitHub members list, and we'll pass in members, and we'll say this dot state dot, I think, members. Okay, so let's go ahead and create this component. So I'll just copy this name, go to my file tree, right click, new file, .js, and we can pretty much just copy the other component and paste it. And I'm just going to rename, instead of props.repositories, we'll say props.members, and then rename repo to member. And then, okay, so in here, we also need to, instead of using GitHub repo card, we were using, I think it was member image. So we can kind of just grab this from app.js, which is no longer being used in this file, and then kind of move it over here and delete the GitHub repo card. And we'll say member image. And I think it was, I forgot what code we had, but I think it was, let's see. Okay, it took in a member. So I'll say member is equal to member. So here in this case, like they're named the same thing, but they could have not been. And I think that should be it. So we'll save this. We'll go back to here. And we do need to import the GitHub members list. So I'll just kind of copy this import and rename these things. So instead of repos, I'll say GitHub members list. And everything should work.
I think you have to change the name of the function in the GitHub members list
Oh, did it? GitHub member.
Like export to
Oh, right, yeah. Thank you. Okay, let's see. Okay, so it's saying cannot read property map of undefined. So that's kind of a similar error to like cannot read set state of undefined. So in this case, right here, we're saying members is equal to this.state.members, but and then kind of deep in here or the next level down, we're calling map on members. But if this thing is undefined, it's going to say cannot call map of undefined, which is kind of the exact error we're getting. So cannot read map of undefined. So it's because back up here, we kind of, I think, previously deleted it. So we just need to kind of initialize it as an empty array again. And that should get rid of the error. So going back, we got our two buttons. If I click on members, we got some members. If we click on repos, we got some repos. Any questions? Now you'll notice just kind of like right here, at least in the old handlebars example from week 1, when we clicked on this, we had like a div with an ID of results and we put all the results inside there, but then we clicked on the other thing and then we put all the results, replaced the results but were already there. So in this case, I just clicked on members and we show members. But if I click on repos, we get the list of repos, but then kind of down here, we also have the list of members. And so it's not exactly quite the same. And so if we look at this, we can see kind of why, because when we click on the second time, like so if we go back and we click on repos after we clicked on members, repos is here and it still has that state of like the previous ones. So any ideas of like how we could do this to kind of like wipe it out? So going back to, let's see. Okay, so let's refresh and kind of see this again. So if I click on members, we see the members. It's just the members. Then I click on repos, and you see both. Now if we go to the component tree in React DevTools, we click on the GitHub members list, and we look at the props, and we can see that like that data still kind of lives in memory in for this component. So the way to wipe this out would be to just like reset this array. So we're going to change this data, and we're going to do that by let's see which one. When we click on repos, we're going to set members to an empty array. So when we set the state, we're going to set members to an empty array, which will trigger this whole component to re-render, in which case members will be empty and then there's nothing to render. And likewise, when we fetch members, we can set repos to an empty array. So you can see here, like kind of thinking back to the handlebars example where we had that div ID results and we just kind of injected inner HTML into the middle of that div. Here we're just kind of changing data. We're changing the state, and React just kind of re-renders what that state is. And so it's kind of a real like different like mental shift, because we're no longer like directly manipulating the DOM, so all the elements on the page. We're just saying let's change the data and then let React do the DOM manipulation. So that's kind of like how all these frameworks are. You just change data and then it renders and keeps things in sync. So now if we kind of look at our example and I click on members, we see members, but then if I click on repos, we see the repos and no members. Click back on members. And so we kind of like wiped out the state from previous, we wiped out kind of previous UI state to kind of trigger only conditionally rendering certain things. Any questions? So React is really kind of just like rendering a projection of the data that we give it. So state, props, and it'll take care of rendering, which is kind of nice because like I know, like if you've ever seen maybe some UIs and maybe you do you click on like you have a chat and you see like an unread message, so you click on that person, you're going to chat with them to read it, but then maybe there's a count somewhere else on the page and it says how many are unread, and those two aren't in sync because in theory like you have clicked all the messages and have read them, but it still says like one unread over here. That's kind of a symptom for when you directly manipulate things on the page. Whereas if you change data and let the framework kind of render a projection of that data, you kind of eliminate a lot of those types of bugs, which are common in like in more like JavaScript heavy front end applications. Okay, so at this point, I'm gonna just make a commit so we have like a stage to go off of, and then we'll kind of continue on. So I'll say git add all, git commit, changes UI to have 2 buttons that trigger data calls. So git push on master. Okay, so if we ever need to revert back, we can go and do that. Okay, so the next thing I want to look at is input. So like with user events and user interaction, you're clicks, event handlers, those types of things, but then you're also going to be probably working with forms, so you type things, validate, all that kind of stuff. So let's look at how inputs work in React, which is kind of different than what you might kind of expect. So I have a link here on the site, so controlled components demo. And if you click it, it might, I don't know if do you guys see the same editor or does it say like login? If you click that link, do you get this? Yeah, okay. So you should be able to play around with it. It's like a playground for tinkering with React code. So if you want to just like try something out and you don't want to spin up a whole new project, you can just kind of do this. It's kind of nice. So in this case, I have, it's just like the main component, and I threw in an input. And so I'm going to go in here and just delete this line part of the value attribute on line 15. And so this is just, your regular HTML input, what you expect. So I type in here, so kind of what you expect. Now, a lot of times with, like say you're building out a form and you want to pre-populate a field, you might do something like this, right? Value equals to maybe some initial state or something like. And so in this case, I'm just pre-populating it with my name. Now, if we go to this input and I type into it, it's not actually, writing to the input. So why is that? And so inputs in React, there's like 2 types. There's ones called controlled inputs or controlled components, and then uncontrolled. And controlled are kind of like the ones that are the most common and kind of follow the React like philosophy. So if we think about like we pre-populated this input with a value of a name. Now, if this input had let me actually modify this data here, this data of this input would be out of sync with this state property, this name state property, right? And so we'd have this inconsistency because in JavaScript memory for this name state variable, it would be David, but then the UI would reflect something else. And so that would just be, obviously like lead to a source of bugs because they're inconsistent. So in order for this to actually for us to say, in order for us to actually kind of change this to make it an input that does update, what we need to do is, as we change the input or type into it, we're going to set the state variable to the new value, and then we'll see it update. So let's see this actually in action. I'll break this out actually on multiple lines so it's easier to see. Okay, so I'm going to say onChange is equal to, and I'm going to pass it a function. So I'm going to say this dot handle handle name input change. So I'm going to go back I'm going to go to my class and add this method. So handle name input change. Now, because we're going to use this inside here, we need this to be, like, we can use either approach that we previously learned. So in this case, I'm just going to use this fat arrow function just to kind of, I think it's a little simpler. And so this function will receive the event object. So similar to like in jQuery, when you did a click, you receive the event object of that click. We get access also to the event. So I could say this dot set state, and we're going to update the name property to event.target.value. So now if we look at this, we can see it's working as expected. It is updating because as we type, so we initialize it with David, as we type, this function gets called with the new value in event, and then we re-update state. Now if I were to not do this and save this and type, it wouldn't update. So these are what are called controlled inputs. Now you could do something kind of interesting here, and I could say like, instead of just updating the state, maybe I say to uppercase. We just uppercase it all. So now as I type, it's just keeping everything capitalized. And we'll look at more like this whole, this like data flow is called, it's typically referred to as like one-way data flow. We'll look at this kind of more next week because you'll see it like through other React code, but yeah, this is kind of like your first exposure to it via inputs. So I put a link to controlled components, well, my little demo here, and then also on this forms link, you can read all about it, and they kind of have some great documentation. So any questions? Okay, so I'm going to close this, and we'll go back to our example. All right, so now let's make a little form. So I'm going to type in form, and then I'll make an input, type is equal to text, and then we'll have a button. Oops. So we're going to make it so in our app we can type in a GitHub organization, and then we'll fetch the data and render it so it's not always tied to like just Ember.js or whatever it's hard, yeah, the hard-coded value that we have. Okay, so for this example, we're actually just going to get rid of the buttons. We don't need them anymore. Okay, so let's wire up our text input. So I'm going to say the value is equal to this dot state dot search value. And we can go back up to our object up here, and then we'll just say we'll add in search value here and just initialize it to an empty string. And I'm going to break this out onto multiple lines so it's easier to see. Okay, so then we'll add in that onChange event handler. So we'll say this is onChange equals to this dot handle search input change. You can name this whatever you want. I just kind of came up with something. And then we will add this method to our class. And we'll use the kind of fat arrow syntax. And it will receive the event. And we'll do just like we did in kind of that browser demo. So we'll say this dot set state. And we'll set search value is equal to event dot target dot value. So also some event.target, this is essentially the input, like the DOM node for the input. So if I were to, actually here, let me save this and then, okay, so let's go ahead and save this. So if you're familiar, like remember from week 1, we said something like document dot maybe get element by ID, and then this was like some input or something, right? It was like name input. So you may have done something like this, and then you said dot value to grab access to, just in plain JavaScript to access an input and then access the value property. This is the same thing, except for event target is passed to us, and event target is like the actual node, so this piece. So this isn't like some weird React thing. This is like, from here on, this is like actual just JavaScript in the browser, and then, or actually all of this, it really is. It's just we get access to the event when we start typing into the input. Okay, so I'll delete that. Okay, so we're going to search when we, so we're kind of typing into the form, and we're just kind of updating this state property called search value. We're not like showing it anywhere, but I think like let's make it so that when I think one way we can handle this search form is when we submit the form. So when we click on the search button, then we'll do the search. You can also do it when you type, but then that pings the API a lot, and there's other considerations you have to do too. Like if you've ever seen on Google, right? You start typing and the search results come in. If you like pause, it gets a little bit more complicated. So we're not going to do that. We're just going to do it when we submit the form. But that's for another time. But let's wire it up so that when we submit the form, we do the search. So I'm going to say, so kind of like on click, we can say on submit is equal to curly's. And we'll say this dot maybe handle search. I think a common convention for like event handlers, you'll see a lot of them prefixed with like handle this, handle that. So, but it doesn't have to be called that. So we'll go here and we'll say handle search is equal to a fat arrow function to keep the this context. So we've seen on click, on change, and on submit. So at this point, when we submit the form, we'll say handle search. And this will also get access to the event, so we can say, now typically I think like, a form when you submit a form, it does like a page reload, right? So you gotta like prevent that from happening. So we're gonna say event.prevent default. So to prevent that default behavior. And then we'll just log out the actual search value. So we can say this.state.search value, just so we can see this in the console. All right, so let's go to the browser. And if I just kind of type in anything and submit, you should see this log to the console. I have these extra errors because like my work computer, they force you to have LastPass, and I can't get rid of it. So I'm guessing you probably don't see this, right? Does anybody see it? No, okay. So unless you have LastPass, you might see it, but yeah, you can ignore mine for now. But yeah, so I can type in, hit search, and you can see this being logged to the console. Actually, I think it doesn't show up in incognito, so let me actually do that just because it's a little distracting. Except if I lose, okay, this is fine though, but yeah. Any questions? Okay, so let's go ahead and do the search now. So given that we have both like the repos and the members list here, we can do where is it? Okay, so let's just add this extra code in here for the loading piece. So we'll say set loading to true. And then at the end, we're going to set it to false so that we see the loading. And then in between those, we'll kind of do the actual data fetching. Now, this is actually the same code that we did kind of when we had all the data load, like just on page load. So it's that same code, but I deleted it, so I'm just going to kind of retype it out. But remember how we had kind of let members and repos is equal to promise or await promise.all. And we just kind of like fired off both of those calls. So I did get members, so we can copy that. So we fired that fetch. And then get repos. And then we're getting the error because of the await, so we need to make sure this function has the async keyword on it. And the last thing to do is once this data comes back, we're going to set this on the state. So we'll say members and repos. And just to, I did get a few questions on this. Like you could say, like, why is it just one word? So in this case, like if I wanted to call it, if I said like members, okay, this doesn't make complete sense, calling it members1. And then I just assign it to the property, the state property members. Like these don't have to be different. But so if that helps any, I don't know. Does that help, or seeing it as different or the same, or does it not matter? All right, I'll assume. Let's just go with 1. And that really should be it for the search. So let's try this out now. So here we go back, and I type in, oh, wait, actually, so we still have this hard-coded. Let's actually change that so it's dynamic. Okay, so I'm going to delete those hard-coded keywords. Now, what value should I place in here? Was it? Yeah. So where is that located?
It's like event.target.
Um, yeah, so in this case, the event is the submit event, right? Because we're submitting the form. So the data is not attached to that event.
Oh, it's called search value.
Yeah. So search value, which is on the state, right? Because as we're changing this input, we have this handle search input change, which is this. And then as we're typing, like we're constantly setting this on the state. And then when we submit the form, and we, like by clicking that submit button, then we can just kind of pull it off. So we already console logged it up here. So we can actually just kind of grab this and paste it in here. So that same value we just console logged to make sure that we had access to, we're going to pass it into get members and get repos. Does that make sense? Any questions on that? Okay, so if I now type in Ember.js, I know this exists. So we see all the data being loaded. Cool. And I don't know what the React one is, but the Angular one I think is just called Angular. And so we did that search for Angular, and we can see the data being loaded, so cool. Now, one downside of this is like I'm not doing any error handling. So if I type in something, like I was doing this a lot where I just type in Ember and that doesn't exist, it's Ember.js. If you search, you'll actually get errors because the API call that it makes, you'll see like a 404 in your console. So, you know, those are things you could like handle in your app, but I'm just, yeah, we'll just do the happy path for now. Yes, question?
I was gonna say how would you handle the errors?
Yeah. I would probably, I would probably have like UI that like shows a message that like that organization isn't found if it, you know, you return like a 404 message or something, or a 404 HTTP status code. I think like a common way, I don't know, we kind of handle errors differently, but sometimes there's some pretty nice libraries like Toaster. If you ever use that, you throw a little like notification in the right-hand corner and it's very easy, something like that.
So do you use strand catch to detect those errors and pull for it?
You can. Like if you catch the error, then you probably want to do something about it. So at least have like some, like in the case of this, right? Like a GitHub organization that doesn't exist, like you can catch it and then like just show a UI. Then there's other errors that you don't want to just like silence like that. Like sometimes an API call will fail. And in those cases, you kind of want to report it back to like the UI team so that you can like fix it later or figure out like sometimes there's errors that happen and it's like maybe somebody was using the app in a way that you didn't expect and then an error happens. There's like services out there that can like catch these errors and like they Ajax it back to somewhere that you can like go ahead and look at later on. So it kind of depends. But in this case, I think like a little toaster saying like this one doesn't exist works great. Okay, so let me make a commit so we can come back to this. I also have like little shortcuts, so that's what this is. You probably don't have that. Okay, so one last piece. and then we'll be done. Actually, two more things. So looking at this, I think the first part is we have these methods, fetch members and fetch repos. It's up to you if you want to delete it. They're not being used because these were being used for the buttons, so I'm just going to actually delete it. Otherwise, like, I don't know, if you come into this later, it's just kind of confusing. So I'm just going to delete these, but you don't have to. Depends if you make commits or not. I'm also going to delete this because this isn't being used. So I think at this point, like, the handle search input change, the handle search, the render, and I think everything else is cool. Gonna make sure everything works. All right, cool. And also delete this console log. Okay, so let me commit. Okay, so the last thing is let's extract this out into a component. It's pretty common, like you build out an app, you have all these different forms. You'll probably want a component just to sort of like isolate or encapsulate like this chunk of UI. So let's go ahead and do that. So let's make it so it's something like this. Like we could call this maybe just like search form. So I'll go ahead and go to source. We'll create a new file. We'll call this searchform.js. And I'm going to say import React from React. And in this case, we're going to use a class because we're going to start doing a couple other things. So I'm not going to use a function, but we're going to start like using state and all that. So I'll say export default class search form extends react.component. Now let's add that render method. And here we're going to return a form, which we'll copy out from the other page. So if we go back to the app component, let's go ahead and just kind of copy out this form here. So we'll copy this out and throw it into the render method over here. And we're going to have to fix some of these things because they're not going to work just right away. Okay, so going back to app.js, let's import this and get this kind of all squared away. So I'm just going to add this import. So I'm just going to copy one of these other ones and just say, let's grab search form. So import that at the top of app.js. And then back down here, that should be cool. Okay, so now let's kind of fix this. Okay, so looking at our page, we're going to get some errors. It's saying cannot read property search value of null. It's kind of like the other one we saw where it's like cannot read something of undefined. It's because the state property is null by default, so it kind of tells you like we haven't set this up yet. So let's go to our search form component. We'll add that constructor. And we're going to say this dot state is equal to an empty object. And every time we just override a constructor, or we create this constructor in a component, we have to just say super props and then pass in props. So every component will just kind of receive the props through the constructor, and the super, this is like a keyword in JavaScript classes that says call the constructor of the parent, and the parent meaning React.component. So this is like another class that this search form one extends from. So like this is really like React.component is a class, and it can have like if you're it can have a bunch of methods defined in it, and if you define them in search form, the ones in search form will take precedence. But if they're not defined there, it just kind of follows back to the ones here. Kind of like in other object-oriented languages that have classes. But if you're not familiar, that's just kind of like a brief overview of how they work. So this is kind of like pretty common boilerplate probably in most React components. Okay, so let's save it. And we can even just, so kind of like in app.js, I think we initialized it to an empty string. So given that we initialized it over here, but it's no longer being used here, let's just copy this out and we'll just remove it from app.js. And we'll move it into search form. So this is kind of a default empty string. This dot handle search input change. So because we moved it into this component, we can just copy this method over. So I'm going to cut and paste this. So handle search input change. And just paste this as a method in the form component. And likewise for handle search for the onSubmit handler, we can just copy this. Well, actually, let's save this for now. Okay, so we've kind of taken care of at least these two. Now we still have to figure out this one. Okay, so any questions up until this point? Okay, so let's assume I copy this and I paste it right here. So if I did that and I did all the necessary imports to kind of make these red lines go away, I would do the search, set the loading to true to toggle that whole thing, fetch the data, then render it. Anyone see any issues with this? So if we kind of look at this, I fetch the data and I have members and repos right here, right? And so if I were to set members and repos as state on the search for component, but this component isn't responsible for rendering members and repos, right? It's the one right above it. It's this one. And that's where the data is being passed in and rendered over here. So it's like this child thing is fetching the data now, but the thing that rendered the child needs access to it. So it's more of like, I mean, these two are, all these components are siblings, right? So it's like, how do I get the data from here over to here? And so like the way to kind of resolve this in component-based frameworks is to take state that's common and kind of lift it up into kind of the next parent state. So it's like lifting the state. And in this case, we could say that what's common between all three of these components is that they're owned by the app component. They're rendered by the app component. So let's keep the state in the app component. And this way, any of these child could potentially use it. So kind of going back to here, I'm not going to kind of copy all this over here. Okay. So we'll kind of undo that, and I'll just add this back. So what I'm going to do instead is I'm just going to pass in this function into this search form component. So I'm going to make up a property, and I'll say like on search. Now you can call this whatever you want. It doesn't really have to be named anything specific. Usually the convention is like on something, but it's kind of up to you. So I'm going to say on search equals this dot handle search. So I'm grabbing this function and I'm keeping this state here like in this app component, but I'm just passing this function down as a prop into search form. So in our previous examples, like these two components down here, we passed in props that were just data, right? They were like lists. You can pass in strings, numbers. In this case, we're actually passing in a function. I could call this David search or whatever I want, really. You can just, it doesn't really matter on the name. But I'm passing in a function as a prop. So now if we go back into search form, we can say this dot props dot, and then what was the name of the prop? In this case, we called it on search. So I can say on search since we passed it in as a prop. So we're just calling the function that was passed in as a prop. Maybe it makes more sense to call like if I were to name this, I think if I had a form component, I think actually, I guess you could say like on search or on submit. Whatever you think is better. But yeah, this isn't like a keyword to JavaScript or React. This is just whatever you, usually when I name these components, like if I pass in a function as a prop, it's on something. So I think on search or on submit seem pretty valid. So if I can save this, when I submit this form, it will just call that prop that was passed to it. Okay, so you can type in something like Ember.js search, and it's actually going to error out. And let's see if I can get the right error. Okay, so the error wasn't so clear that I was going to expect, but all right, like we're passing in handle search, and this thing, one sec. Oh, right, okay. Okay, so if we look at our handle search method, we're expecting the state search value, right, to pass in. But inside search form, now it's part of the state of this component. So like, how do we deal with that? So what we can do is let's just kind of create another method. We're going to create one called handle search. And this is what we're going to call when we call on submit. So we'll say this dot handle search. And because I'm not doing the fat arrow just for now because we don't need it, but yeah. Okay, so here now we can say this dot props dot on search. So we're going to invoke it, but we need to pass in. So we're gonna like take the state from here and just pass it into it. So we're gonna pass in this.state.search value. So we're going to execute the prop on search with the state that's contained within the search form component. So that means, given here, we actually need to adjust our app component, because right now it's saying event, right? And this doesn't quite make sense. This actually will receive the search term. So we're going to change this back in the app component. Delete the event.prevent default. And then we're going to say, let's actually call this search value, just to be consistent. And then we can get rid of this.state.search value. So we have this search function. It lives inside the app component. It expects the search value. When we submit the form, which gets passed in as a prop called onSearch, it takes this value, does the search, and then sets the state so that these two components that are siblings have access to the data. Now, we still need to do one more thing. On the onSubmit, this will receive an event object. And so when we submit the form, we can just call event.prevent default here. So it's a little weird, but I think the high level is that we need members and repositories to be state on the kind of parent component, meaning the app component, because all three of these kind of like interact in some way. And so if this got the data, it would need to share it with these two. And so the best way to share it is to leave members and repos as state inside the app component, but then just pass in the search part of the as a function into search form so that it can get called with the search value, which is like internal or like state. It's part of state as the search form. So this is kind of like how it exposes it. So we submit the form. It calls handle search with just as every submit event, it receives the event object. We prevent the default form submission so it doesn't refresh the page. Then we call that prop on search with the value, the search value, which is state for this component. It receives it, does its like loading and fetching the data, setting members and repos, and then these things can render. So let's make sure this works. Yes?
You need an enum handle in your form.
In my form.
This dot handle search.
21.
Ooh, thank you. Okay, so if I do Ember.js, search, let's see. Oh, does anyone see the bug? So I'm getting the error. So cannot read props or property props of undefined, and then looking at this. So it's highlighting this line.
Oh, this isn't bound to the handle.
Yeah. So yeah, I forget it too. So this does actually need to be a fat arrow or bound in the constructor, the other approach too. Because we are using this here. We're just not using this dot set state.
So like every time you use this, you should just find this.
Just use this like fat arrow syntax, like that's general rule of thumb, it'll probably work great. And even if you used it and you didn't use this, then it's not going to cause any like issues. There might be, I don't know, maybe there's like performance implications. I don't know, I guess.
I was doing some Discord bot work the other day, juggling callbacks and promises, and just like taking in and removing dot bind this because in ways that really didn't make sense.
Oh.
Discord was confusing.
All right, so let's go ahead and try it. So I type in Ember.js, search, looks good. Kind of get all the data. Angular. See all the data. So looks like it's working. Any questions? So I think like the takeaway here is like, you know, components are great and for isolating chunks of like UI, and you end up creating like these big hierarchies, right? And you have siblings, parents, grandchildren, all kinds of like things. It's like this big tree. And if you need to share data, you just ideally you want to lift that data or that state to the parent that sees all the ones that need it, and that's how you kind of like share data. You might find some like weird blog posts of like, how do I share data into these two and like sending them messages or something. Like, nah, you just like lift it up and then you let it like trickle back down. That's kind of like the conventional way for most scenarios. And I posted a couple links here. There's this one called Lifting State Up. So this is actually the just in the main concepts for React. And even Ember, they call it, there's one called Lowest Common Ancestor. Like conception, like if you look at it's, I think this one doesn't even have like Ember, maybe a little bit, but you could still figure it out. So it's the same concept, but so if you want like another really good example, they'll kind of show how do you kind of pull out this data so that all components can have access to it. Okay, any questions on that? So that's kind of just more into like how data flows, state, and then user events, and working with like inputs, clicks, submits, all that kind of stuff. So for the assignment, to next week. So this one, you're going to modify your kind of Reddit homework, and you're going to do a few things. You're going to use the same exact repo. You're not going to create a new repo just because just already you're building off the same thing. You'll add a search bar, so kind of like what we did just now. And so that should be similar. And then there's two kind of new features. So there's a previous search history. So like as you make search, you'll have like a list somewhere that shows all your previous searches. And then you can click on one of those items and it'll kind of research it, so you don't have to retype it in the input. So there's that piece. And then every time you click on like a thread or post or whatever they call it in Reddit, you'll also just kind of keep track of a total every time some of these things are clicked. So at the top, it'll just start off with 0, and every time you click a post, it'll just increment. And when you reload the page, it's going to get reset back to 0. It's not like persisting to a database or anything, but just so you can kind of like experience more events and make this whole thing more interactive.
For purposes of grading, it might be nice to have people fork the repo and clone it into a new folder.
Oh, okay. Would that help?
Well, just because people are going to start making changes now before the due date, and I'm in grading going to run to the assignment, and it could be in the middle of changes and broken.
Oh, yes. Okay. Yeah, okay. I'll update this. You can, well, let's see. Then I got to explain the forking stuff.
Could we just send you the commit ID of the one that we want to create?
Let's see, how do I make this consistent?
Oh, yeah, okay. I guess honestly, I can just look back through the commit history and clone the one that's before the due date or before the major changes.
Huh. What if we just do like another branch?
That would also work. It's something you have to explain, but
Okay.
the question
Okay.
is, which would you like to explain more?
Okay, actually the forking isn't so bad because you just click the button. Okay, yeah, so if you have like your home, so like, let's see, let me pick a repo on my own thing. Yeah. Okay, so I have like a repo. So I think if you just click fork, I'm gonna fork it into just where's my pro?
If you have not yet finished assignment 3, I recommend you do this after finishing.
Yeah,
it,
you
otherwise
definitely
you'll
wanna
have
do-
fix the bugs on both of them, which is annoying.
Oh, I can't fork my own thing. That's why. That makes sense. Okay, Ember.js or something. I don't know. Ember.js
I
GitHub.
mean, if you can't fork your own repo, then that would also be a problem for this.
Oh yeah, huh? Makes sense. Wait, can you not? Oh, it's weird. I thought you would like be able to fork it and rename it at the same time. Okay, let's do the git branch thing. We'll just quickly go over that.
I guess it's necessary later.
Yeah, I mean it's still useful. Okay, so like, let's call this branch assignment 4. So like master branch, it'll just be assignment 3. So just when you're ready to do assignment 4, which you should do like once you complete assignment 3, since it kind of builds off of it, do git checkout -b and just say assignment 4, and then you just make all your commits there. So I would do this. I'll kind of type in, do all my code, push up assignment 4. When you're ready to push up, you'll say, instead of like git push origin master, you'll say git push origin assignment 4, and then this will push it up. So just call it assignment 4, and then this way we can get access to it, and then it's just the same repo. The only unfortunate thing, I guess, is like,
Is this
So-
repo going to continue to be built on after assignment?
no, this is the last one, so it's fine. I think let's see, in the week 3 assignment, yeah, I told you to call it assignment 3. So assignment 4 is like a branch off of this. It's
Things
fine.
Things already get messy enough with like the same cert Heroku app for all of the assignments and things. It'll be fine.
Yeah, so let's just do that, and obviously this lecture is recorded. So, but I'll update the description on the assignment so you guys can read it. And with that, yeah, I guess we'll end for today, and yeah, see you next week.